In the Future War, we saw colossal tanks and massive VTOLs on the side of the machines. But for humanity, things were on the lighter side, with small armoured cars and rapid buggies with mounted weapons. But why did the Resistance shelve the heavier armoured vehicles like armoured personnel carriers and main battle tanks for these lighter weight civilian replacements? The main and lesser known reason for this change in vehicle approach was because of the introduction of plasma weapons. These plasma launching nightmares could burn through armour like a hot knife through butter. Even small arms plasma guns could burn through armoured personnel carriers' armour with just a few hits. All of a sudden, the average Terminator on the battlefield had a weapon to deal with every threat, be it infantry or armoured vehicles. And obviously, once you scale the plasma weapons up to Skynet's vehicles, they could annihilate any tank or APC with a single shot. But plasma has one major downside over standard ammunition. It's slow in comparison by quite a far margin. As you can see, plasma weaponry rounds travel significantly slower than a standard bullet. And over long distances, things such as long-range anti-tank guided missiles have far greater speed than heavy plasma weapons, and the missiles can also adjust their trajectory, whereas plasma weapons have no such ability. So with many advantages come some major negatives. This is where we see a major ramp up in resistance-light vehicle use, as the light trucks and buggies can, with a very confident driver and some mad manoeuvres, outpace the plasma weaponry. This was huge against things like the HK aerial, as even with their advanced targeting, a combination of human unpredictability and fast speed allowed these light vehicles to avoid the plasma fire and then return fire and neutralise the machine threat. This was very useful with rocket and missile armed buggies, and the kills began to stack up. It's crazy how Skynet forced us to go from advanced military vehicles to small ramshackle buggies due to them being able to defeat our armour so easily. And this was also a major favour for humanity from Skynet, as these vehicles are far more simple overall. These light to no armoured vehicles were in some cases little more than a frame with wheels, which made plasma less effective against them, as let's say when the gunner was hitting an open top buggy, he would die but the driver was normally fine unless he was then hit. Whereas if they were in an armoured vehicle like an armoured personnel carrier and the plasma round penetrated the armour, the crew was stuck in a box with superheated plasma and would then be suffering from the heat and the lack of oxygen as the plasma round burnt up the oxygen around them with the fire. Obviously any fires started internally would also suck the oxygen away. It's a pretty horrible place to be. It's a little like how anti-tank weapons tend to be more effective against hard-skin vehicles than soft-skin vehicles, because obviously they're designed to penetrate armour specifically. So in some cases, being in a soft-skin vehicle when hit by something that penetrates armour very well is better. It may seem crazy, but look into it. For instance, these kind of light vehicles that are in Afghanistan, there's pictures where some of them have survived the heavier IEDs that are designed to take out like armoured personnel carriers because they were soft-skinned. But obviously, having less armour opened yourself up to other vulnerabilities, such as being vulnerable to lighter weapons and shrapnel. So there's always a few trade-offs. The simplicity of these vehicles was a huge boon for the Resistance, especially as the organisation was building its strength. Its resources was very limited, so having the ability to repair and maintain complicated military vehicles was rare, and that's if you had access to spare parts, which most of the time they didn't. So when the Resistance started to use repurposed civilian vehicles, it was a blessing for the mechanics and the scavenger teams. No longer did they have to hope they could find a specific part for something like a Bradley APC or an Abrams main battle tank. Now they had a choice of many common vehicles. Using something like a Ford or Toyota pickup truck gave an abundance of spare parts, and whole vehicles could be found abandoned, so it was great. You could just literally come across a pickup truck that was in a working condition with a little bit of tinkering, and there you had a working vehicle. And with a little kit, they were also fit for the battlefield. All they had to do was soup the engine up to make it as fast as possible, obviously for manoeuvring away from the plasma, and to add whatever heavy weapons they had available, be it a 50 caliber heavy machine gun or an anti-tank guided missile. The fuel consumption of these vehicles was also far less than most heavily armoured vehicles, so something like a main battle tank needed fuel for a dozen vehicles just to run for a day. The same amount could keep a convoy of lighter cars and vans going for hundreds of miles. And also, with the wide availability of parts, it was a lot easier to convert engines to run off either diesel, gasoline or biofuel if needed. And it wouldn't be too wild to see the Resistance mechanics using captured plasma reactors to power their vehicles, basically a post-apocalyptic Tesla. Vehicle variety was also a massive benefit of the switch to civilian converted vehicles. Everything from buggies to massive 18-wheeler trucks had their place in the Resistance, and with gifted mechanics anything was possible. And Skynet hated such adaptability. It knew the exact schematics and performance of something like a Striker armoured personnel carrier, but a random converted car with a minigun mounted to the roof and an upgraded engine was a complete mystery to Skynet, and by the time it had learnt its abilities and performance, it would then run into a completely different vehicle churned out by the Resistance's garages. The randomness and unpredictability must have really got Skynet's wires in a twist, and the civilian nature of the vehicles also allowed many to blend into the apocalyptic environment, with unarmed vehicles looking little more than junkers on the street. But once the Skynet patrols had passed by, the Resistance would start them up and move on. It was camouflage in plain sight. The training of crews also became far easier, as most of the Resistance vehicles only required a driver and a gunner, and most Resistance frontline fighters were able to use pretty much any weapon that was mounted. Also, the drivers only needed basic driving skills. These were converted civilian vehicles, and because most of the fighting was in the USA, they would all be automatic, so there was no need to even learn your gears. A great benefit for the scavenger teams with these light vehicles was that field recovery missions became easier. With a decent truck, they could easily tow and reclaim damaged vehicles without the need for specialist heavy-duty military recovery vehicles. And if wheels and axles were broken beyond repair, a smart team could always find a way to get it to a safe place to do those immediate field repairs, and once completed, get the vehicle back to the garages so it could be battle ready within days. As we saw in the first Terminator film, small vehicles like Buggies could fit into the tight confines of the underground Resistance strongholds, something that larger vehicles had no hope of. For these smaller Resistance cells, this allowed for safe repairs underground away from Skynet's patrols. There was no need to risk staying out in the open or in a ruined building to fix up your vehicles, and having the feeling of safety would allow crews to work far better than being paranoid and jumping at every odd sound in the fear that a Terminator had showed up to kill you. The convertible nature of these vehicles was also fantastic for the Resistance's needs, as when for instance a vehicle with a heavy machine gun would be more useful than one armed with an anti-air weapon like a Stinger missile, when it was as simple as changing the weapon over, nothing too hard for the Resistance's mechanics and armourers. But on something like a military vehicle like, let's say, a Bradley armoured personnel carrier, changing the main weapon out and replacing it with something else is quite difficult because they're specifically designed with those weapons in mind. It means moving the main gun and then probably modifying the actual turret, which is a major conversion, and it would actually probably compromise the armour, which then defeats the point of having a heavily armoured vehicle. So for these kind of small, simple vehicles, being able to change the weapons over quite easily was massive in the long run, and it allowed for that flexibility, especially for smaller Resistance cells who might not have as many vehicles available to them. And it helped that the nations that were supplying the Resistance forces in the USA, Europe and North Asia, which were the main combat zones, were able to transport light vehicles and civilian-style vehicles a lot easier than military ones. It could be done by ship, rail or even air, and these vehicles could also just be driven to the required area. They didn't need too much fuel, and obviously if it's a civilian vehicle, anyone who knows how to drive can just take it up there without any specific training. Whereas something like a tank needs to be moved either by heavy rail or by ships. These are tough, massive vehicles to move, and if you do want to drive it to the area, you do need someone who actually knows how to drive the tank, so it requires training. They also use a ton of fuel, and then you got to factor in the maintenance, because something like an Abrams tank, I think it's 3 hours maintenance for every hour of use, which is a hell of a lot of maintenance for the poor guys and gals who have to service such an armoured beast. It's also a bonus with lighter vehicles that they can cross like bridges and even small light wooden bridges. So you got to imagine by the time the Future War's been going on for about 5 to 10 years, so the first decade, most highways and major bridges would be in a state of disrepair. They'd be an absolute mess, and heavy vehicles would cause them to crumble, so these lighter civilian vehicles could creep across a damaged highway or a small, bridge, or even just over like small roads in general, because most roads are going to crumble over the heavier weight of these, military vehicles. So that's something definitely to think about in the long term as well. It's amazing to me to see the adaptation of vehicle warfare. There is a point where weapons defeat almost any armour, and going back to simpler, unarmoured designs is better. And we actually see different variations of this kind of adaptation happening in our own world with the introduction of drone warfare on the battlefield, with some crews turning their tanks into like massive behemoth turtle looking things with lots of like armour, netting and stuff to try and defeat the drones. Whereas other crews go for kind of light and manoeuvrable quick vehicles to outrun and get away from the drones so they can't be hit. And I think the Resistance follows that kind of thinking a lot more. Anyway, it was a fun little video to make. I do like the vehicles of the Resistance, and I always find that vehicles are always cool when it comes to warfare. But give me your thoughts on it, and tell me what I got right, what I got wrong in your opinion. It's always interesting to hear your thoughts on the stuff. And as always, guys, thanks for watching, and have a beautiful evening.